There are a lot of very large Threadripper motherboards that got revealed in the past couple of weeks. These align with the TRX50 and WRX90 chipsets that are coming out for the upcoming AMD Threadripper 7000 launch, which is due out later in November. We recently covered AMD's announcement, including both the Pro and non-Pro HEDT CPUs in a standalone news video, so check that out if you missed it. But now we have various boards to do an overview of, so we're basically going through the spec listings and through the photos of ASUS, ASRock, Gigabyte, and Supermicro motherboards for the Threadripper platform. MSI, sadly, not present for this one. We'll talk about that as well. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and the CryoSheet graphene pads. These CryoSheets are molecularly stacked in the Z-axis to encourage vertical direct thermal transfer from the IHS to the cooler. CryoSheet pads are made to be easily applicable for a thermal interface and completely avoid paste dryout because it's not paste. It makes them particularly useful for long service life systems with minimal maintenance. They come in multiple sizes for suitability on the most common laptops and desktop CPUs, and you can learn more at the Thermal Grizzly CryoSheets at the link in the description below. First up, AMD's two Threadripper platforms have a couple of variations in compatibility. So for Pro and non-Pro, known as HEDT for the latter, there's a mix where the WRX90 platform for Pro Threadripper CPUs will only support Threadripper Pro chips, whereas the TRX50 Enthusiast HEDT platform will support both Pro and HEDT or non-Pro CPUs. We'd recommend sticking to the Pro platform for Pro CPUs in most cases, but technically you could run them in TRX50. And again, this content will be a preliminary flyover of all the different boards. We don't have even really any pricing yet, so we'll be talking about that separately as we get it. But for now, we have boards and specs, and some of them look pretty crazy. Actually, the craziest one was ATX form factor one, as in it was the least physically imposing and impressive, but the most impressive for fitting in a normal case. First up is MSI. MSI has nothing. We asked, we sent them an email. They are totally sitting this launch out. They haven't announced any official Threadripper 7000 support at the time of writing and hosting this. MSI previously supported Threadripper 3000 with the Creator TRX40 and one other board, and we reached out to MSI for further comment, and the company responded with simply, quote, "We don't have any plans for Storm Peak and will not have TRX50 or WRX90 motherboards." It doesn't get any more straightforward than that. So, on to the next one. First up from an actually participating board partner is ASUS with the Pro WS TRX50-SAGE WiFi. It's a CEB-sized board with a doubled 18-phase VRM, so they total that as 36 phases when counted that way, and that's an 18 by 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 4 VRM design. The new Threadripper 7000 CPUs all have a rated TDP of 350 watts, so compared to the VRM capability here, that's low. The VRM is overkill, but there's a few reasons for this. One is marketing. The other one is the board partners want to make sure the VRM design is capable of not only pushing that much power, but also staying cool under hours of sustained load like you'll have in a serious workstation. The CPUs are also fully overclockable and likely will blow out the efficiency curve if they're overclocked heavily. So the VRM will be helpful there as well. Plus, efficiency is a good thing with this type of CPU, and a better VRM will help provide that. That's particularly true, though, if running at liquid nitrogen without a heatsink for breaking world records. There are power connectors all over the board, including some for a second power supply, shown covered by black plugs in the photos. In total, there are 4 CPU 8 pins, 2 24 pins, and 2 extra PCIe power plugs on the right edge near the chipset. ASUS also throws in 2 CPU 8-pin to PCIe 8-pin conversion cables for power supplies that don't have enough native CPU 8 pins. The second power supply connection will help with overclocking. So we're not sure if ASUS plans to support redundancy of power supplies here, but in either event, it makes multi-power supply cases suddenly more interesting. So even without redundancy, if you're gonna run 2 power supplies, and you're not just doing it for XOC on top of a table, taking 6 feet of table for one computer, then something like a Lian Li 011 series case, suddenly there's value in that dual power supply support where you yank a drive cage and replace it with a power supply cage instead. And you'll have to check each different case to make sure they still support that. But something like that proves a useful option in a workstation build where you might just want 2 power supplies. But you don't need 2 power supplies just to run the board. You can run it with 1. Back to the VRM, the need to manage VRM heat output is evidenced by the massive heat sinks that surround 3 sides of the enormous socket. The flanking heat sinks that include fans are also for the VRM and other board components in the I/O area, with RAM-oriented north and south of the socket. We like that the upper VRM heatsink is actually finned. It doesn't have a bunch of decorative plates or massive chunks of aluminum without any finning, so this is good. There are only 4 DIMM slots on this board, meaning it's a 1 DIMM per channel setup. That's good for stability and speed, but more restrictive for capacity. Workstation setups that need a serious amount of memory will need to be equipped with the highest capacity DDR5 modules available. ASUS says that up to a terabyte of ECCR DIMM DDR5 is supported, but since there are only 4 slots here, that would require using 256GB sticks to hit. Now, 256GB sticks actually are a thing, and these particular sticks cost $3,200. You could spend over 10 grand on 1 terabyte of RAM for this board, depending on the spec and where it's purchased. Now, in between Wendell rebuilding our website and helping us launch it, again, gamersnexus.net if you want to see the new revamped version of the site, he noted that Threadripper 5000, who had had a BIOS bug for almost a year where only 7 of 8 DIMMs would work. And so that there's been some posts on their level 1 text forums about that. So you'll want to check the QVL for memory on these. QVL often gets overlooked, where it's the qualified vendor list. Each motherboard typically will maintain a QVL where they say these are the kits we've tested on this board and are confirmed to be good. For boards that get into high or relatively uncommon capacities, at least for HEDT, you'll really want to look at the QVL because you're more and more likely to end up in some edge case they haven't tested for, and it's not always a given that memory just works when you socket it into the board. So make sure you check on that for Threadripper. The TRX50-SAGE is also capable of IPMI remote management via ASUS's IPMI expansion cards that launched last year. It's not quite as handy as having it built into the motherboard directly, but it's good that it's possible. The WRX90 board has it built in. PCIe connectivity is relatively generous. It has 3 Gen 5 slots and 2 Gen 4. These are physically full-length by 16 slots, but based on the photo, the electrical wiring isn't by 16 in all of them. The second slot from the bottom appears to be limited to by 4 based on the missing pins we're seeing, again, just from the photo. Storage options include 3 M.2 slots, 4 SATA, and 1 Slim SAS connector with NVMe support. Slim SAS is a connection standard from the server world that's capable of carrying SATA, SAS, and NVMe, just depending on how it's set up on the device side. Rear I/O is an interesting mix on this board. There are 2 USB 2 headers, which is useful for input compatibility, particularly for BIOS. It has 6 10GB USB Type-A ports and a single 20GB Type-C port. In order to get USB 4, you'd have to connect an add-in card to an internal header. Networking is handled by 10GB and 2.5GB LAN ports and built-in Wi-Fi 7. ASUS in its press release also announced its Pro WS WRX90E-SAGE SE motherboard, which has an even longer name than the last one, so it's probably better. That's normally how that works. This is for the Threadripper 7000 Pro line, and in the press release they didn't include any photos, but we got a couple of them from ASUS. This board is absolutely massive. It's even more packed than the TRX50 board. ASUS provided us with a table to distinguish the key changes, and based on the press release, the table, and the images, some of the defining features that are supposed to differentiate it from the TRX50 board, other than the CPUs themselves, include a bump up to 7 total PCIe 5.0 slots at physical by 16 length, an additional fan to cool the M.2 devices in the chipset, dual 10GB LAN, built-in IPMI and BMC, and rear USB 4. Next up is ASRock, with the simply named ASRock TRX50 WS. The first few things that jumped out at us for this board, other than the tragic lack of additional X's and the lack of several numbers, is the fact that this board has a lot of fans. Given that this is a workstation board, there's normally more baked-in tolerance for noise, and those small fans will bring with them some additional whine, particularly at the top end of the RPM curve. Overall, it has a more stripped-down look as compared to the ASUS board, which is perfectly fine. Not every board needs to be huge, and slimming down should help with cost. But the important thing is that it can hit the objectives without running wildly inefficient or having an overheating VRM. Nearly the entire back of the board is covered by a metal backplate that sinks heat via some thermal pads. This can help, it depends on the board. In our experience, it's less helpful than a GPU backplate is because the motherboard's backplate is sandwiched against the case and it has less ability for heat to be effectively removed from the system. A GPU backplate has more exposure to front case fans, so there's some more wicking potential there. Power delivery is handled by an 18 plus 3 plus 3 phase design, which ASRock says is using 110 amp phases. It's technically compatible with dual power supplies in the same way that every board is technically compatible with them, by using an adapter cable that just wires up the signaling pins used to tell the second power supply when to turn on and off. ASRock also says that this lowers the risk of fire. Great. Good. There's no second 24-pin connector on the board. That helps with size for sure. It might help a little bit with cost, but it does mean a messier implementation. The memory layout is the same. It's one DIMM per channel setup, as we saw on the ASUS board. ASRock specifically claims up to DDR5 7600 support in its spec page. One of the biggest points to an HEDT platform, though, is the much greater I/O capability as compared to regular desktops. That's reflected here. The board is equipped with 5 physical by 16 PCIe slots, with 3 of them on Gen 5 and 2 on Gen 4. The Gen 5 slots are wired to run slots 1 and 3 at by 16, with slot 4 listed as by 8 in ASRock's spec table. Slots 2 and 5 are Gen 4, supporting by 4 and by 8 modes. Storage up next. First off, it's handled by 2 M.2 slots, but one of them is blazing, and the other one is hyper. Naturally, blazing is higher up in the hierarchy than hyper. This is obvious, of course. It's almost as obvious as numbers. Too bad we don't have any for PCIe generations. Ultra probably falls somewhere within this hierarchy, but really it's blazing that matters, we think. The names keep changing. It also has 4 SATA, 2 Slim SAS, and 1 MCIO. We had to look up what that last one is, and we're glad we did because MCIO apparently stands for Mini Cool Edge I/O. And no, we're not joking, that is the name. It's another form factor designed to transmit PCIe signals over a cable, somewhat similar to Oculink or U.3, but the connector design should be capable of PCIe 6.0 once it arrives. Rear I/O is made up of 6 USB Type-A ports, 4 at 10 gigabit and 2 at 5 gigabit. There are 2 Type-C ports, 1 at 20 and 1 at 10 gigabits per second, 2 LAN ports, 1 10 gigabit and 2.5 gigabit, Wi-Fi 6E, and some basic audio connectivity. It doesn't seem like USB 4 is anywhere on this one, not even internally, and it's not listed in their spec sheet. ASRock also has the WRX90 WS Evo, which sounds like a Subaru. The ASRock press release shows off a little bit of its WRX90 WS Evo motherboard for Pro CPUs, but there's no dedicated product page at the time of writing. We do have one low-res photo to work with, though. It's clearly a larger board with 8 DIMM slots for the Threadripper Pro CPU's 8 memory channels and an additional VRM cooling fan on the right side, totaling 5. There's also 7 physically full-length PCIe by 16 slots, but we're not sure of the electrical wiring. LAN is upgraded too, with dual 10 gigabit and an additional dedicated management port. The board also appears to be wider. Gigabyte is up next. So far, they have only announced one board for Threadripper 7000, at least at the time of filming this. They'll probably have more, but let's take a look at the one they have announced. This one is the Gigabyte TRX50 Aero D. It's definitely the most aesthetically focused so far, with a silvery bare aluminum look across all of the heat sinks and the rear I/O cover. It's not clear from the photos we have today whether there are any built-in heatsink fans, but it doesn't look like it. There aren't any perforations in the I/O cover either to suggest if one might be hiding there. The board's spec page claims a 16 plus 8 plus 4 phase VRM, and if it turns out that there aren't going to be any fans included with this board for the VRM heatsink, then fans mounted on the top of the case would help with cooling it. It's not as fully finned though as it probably should be. Instead, Gigabyte is relying on larger blocks of aluminum. The thermal tab for the board states presence of an 8mm heat pipe through the VRM heatsink though, to help move some of the heat around. Compared to the other boards, the Aero D has less PCIe connectivity for the boards we're looking at today. It's cut down to only 3 full-length slots. That said, Gigabyte is really proud of its PCIe UD slot X, boasting 10x strength for graphics card. Fantastic. We'll need that when the RTX 5090 Cinder Block edition comes out. The Aero D has a lot of M.2 slots, totaling 4, and contributing to the general feeling that this is the most desktop-aligned Threadripper 7000 board we've seen so far. Backing that up is the fact that it doesn't look like it has any enterprise-grade storage connectivity in the likes of Slim SAS, U.3, or MCIO, or at least none that were listed on the product page at the time of writing. It does, however, appear to have 8 SATA ports on the right edge. Rear I/O includes both 10 gigabit and 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. There's also Wi-Fi 7, 4 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, and 2 USB 4 Type-C ports. This plus the M.2 support position the board in an interesting place where it could be the best option for a user who needs to regularly transfer large files onto and off of external storage. An example might be a dedicated video transcode station or something, where the user needs to dump the footage onto the system, transcode it, move it to another editing station. Of course, there's more boards coming out that we haven't seen yet, so maybe this will kind of evolve. One last curious addition to the rear I/O is a DisplayPort in. The most immediately useful case we could think of would be if the user wants to run the USB 4 right below it as a display output for monitors that require a Type-C input. This is done by running a DisplayPort cable between the discrete GPU and the motherboard. Gigabyte hasn't published a manual at the time of writing, so we're not able to confirm that this is the intended purpose, but it's our best speculation right now. Finally, we have Supermicro with the H13SRA-TF. It's by far the board with the most alphanumerically complex name, and that makes it better. But unironically, it's the most function-focused Threadripper board that we've looked at so far, and in typical Supermicro fashion, they are completely focused on that functionality. The aesthetics are secondary. If you haven't heard of Supermicro, perhaps you are mostly a sort of desktop gaming type system builder, but Supermicro is prevalent in server and in high-end builds where you might want that extra functionality, IPMI, stuff like that. It's also notable for being the smallest board that's been announced at true ATX size. Since this is built to be more of a serious work motherboard, it features dedicated LAN for IPMI, dual 10 gigabit LAN, 1 COM port, and a VGA port. And yes, those are still useful. In fact, we actually still use VGA ports for our server system. For storage, it's got 4 SATA. PCIe is listed as 2 PCIe 5.0 by 8 with the slot cut, 2 PCIe 5.0 by 16, 1 PCIe 4.0 by 8, and MCIO connector. This board would be particularly useful in a server solution, something like the first one that we built with Wendell, actually the second one as well, where being able to remote into the server and monitor all the sensors, not necessarily just within Linux, but through its own interface, that's a huge feature and a great value add. It's useful for home servers, just as it is for sort of a small business type server, which is what we're using. So that's something that makes these types of boards particularly interesting, and the smaller form factor is of course beneficial as well for case compatibility. So that's it for the overview. We're not sure how many of these we'll be looking at with the Threadripper launch. Typically we try to run our CPU reviews on ASUS boards just because we have a good understanding of the BIOS and where we can lock stuff down to keep like for like testing. So we'll probably be trying to test on one of those boards for launch at least. It's likely we'll work on getting a Gigabyte one. Hopefully MSI comes to the party. If they do, we'll take a look at one of those. But either way, the options we've covered here have enough differences between them where users who have a specific idea or concept for their Threadripper build probably already know which one they're pointed towards. Things like I/O, one of the key differentiating factors here. And if you need assistance in trying to figure out which board to buy, first of all, wait for them to launch so that people can use them and talk about them. But secondly, probably the number one thing you're looking at, other than does it clear the basis for a decent VRM, is going to be the I/O support, and specifically what you need for your build, and features like IPMI, if that's important to you. But there aren't a lot of boards, and they're all going to be relatively expensive. It is exciting, though, to have this type of product back on the market, because HEDT was kind of dead for a couple years. Pricing, of course, is a lot different from what it was in the first generation of Threadripper and the second generation of Threadripper, although it's maybe closer to the Threadripper 5000 Pro stuff. So pricing's higher than it used to be, but in the very least, it's nice to have that enthusiast market kind of coming back and giving some more options. And we're excited to work with it because for our use cases as a business, a lot of times we can make use of those extra I/O and PCIe lane capabilities. Okay, so that's going to be it for this one. We will be working on reviews for Threadripper. As soon as we have it in, we'll have them public, hopefully around or just before the launch of the product. Hopefully, we'll see. And as always, thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to support us directly, like by grabbing one of our brand new GN15 emblem pint glasses, or you can go to gamersaccess.net if you just want to check out the website and see the written version of content. This will be ported over there in written format in not too long. So, thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.